An innocent cop is sentenced to death for a crime he didn't commit. As he counts down his final days on death row, the only one who still believes in him is his loyal German shepherd. Then, just when all hope seems lost, the dog does something no one ever expected, something that will unravel the truth, expose a dangerous conspiracy, and change the course of justice forever. How does a single act from a dog shake the entire system? And will it be enough to save his owner before it's too late? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The autumn night wrapped around Liam Parker's patrol car like a thick blanket as he cruised through the sleepy streets of Cedar Grove. Beside him, Titan sat alert in the passenger seat, his dark eyes scanning the shadows beyond the windshield. The German shepherd's ears twitched at every sound, a habit that always made Liam smile. "Easy, boy," Liam said softly, reaching over to scratch behind Titan's ears. The radio crackled to life, breaking the peaceful silence. "Unit 247. Possible break-in reported at the old Riverside warehouse on Mason Street. Please investigate." Liam's stomach tightened. Something about the call felt wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on why. He keyed his radio. "Unit 247 responding. ETA 5 minutes. As they pulled up to the warehouse, Titan's usual calm demeanor shifted. The dog's muscles tensed, and a low whine escaped his throat. Liam felt it too, an uneasiness that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "I know, buddy," Liam whispered, drawing his flashlight. "Let's check it out." The warehouse loomed before them, its broken windows like dark eyes staring down at them. Liam's footsteps echoed on the concrete as they entered, Titan padding silently beside him. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing rusty machinery and scattered debris. Titan suddenly stopped, his body rigid. A growl rumbled deep in his chest. "What is it, boy?" Liam swept his light around, but saw nothing unusual. The air felt thick with tension. Without warning, the emergency lights they'd spotted when entering clicked off, plunging them into total darkness. Before Liam could reach for his radio, something hard struck the back of his head. Pain exploded through his skull as he crumpled to the ground. Through the fog of consciousness, he heard Titan's fierce bark and the sound of paws launching across concrete. A shot rang out, deafening in the enclosed space. Then silence fell, heavy and absolute. When Liam's eyes fluttered open, red and blue lights were flashing through the warehouse windows. His head throbbed mercilessly, and something warm and sticky covered his hands. Blood. So much blood. He tried to push himself up, his vision swimming. That's when he saw him, Anthony Vega, sprawled just a few feet away, a knife wound in his chest. The informant's empty eyes stared at nothing. "Don't move!" The shout came from behind him, followed by the sound of multiple footsteps. Liam turned to see his fellow officers flooding into the warehouse, their weapons trained on him. Officer Martinez, who he'd shared coffee with just that morning, roughly yanked him to his feet. The cold steel of handcuffs bit into his wrists. "Wait," Liam said, his voice hoarse. "Where's Titan? What happened to my dog?" No one answered. Their faces were masks of stone as they led him away, leaving him with nothing but the echo of that gunshot in his mind and the terrifying uncertainty of his partner's fate. The fluorescent lights of courtroom 7-0 cast harsh shadows across Liam Parker's face as he sat rigid in his chair, his eyes fixed on the jury box. 3 months had passed since that night at the warehouse, but the memory still haunted him like a bad dream he couldn't shake. Next to him, Erin Calloway shuffled through her papers with steady hands, but Liam could see the tension in her shoulders. She had fought hard for him, digging through evidence, challenging witnesses, and pushing back against a system that had already decided his guilt. "The prosecution's evidence is circumstantial," Aaron had told him earlier that morning. "We just need one juror to see the truth." But looking at their faces now, Liam saw only judgment. District Attorney Monroe approached the witness stand, his confidence filling the room. "Officer Martinez, could you describe the scene when you arrived at the warehouse?" "We found Officer Parker kneeling over the victim's body. His hands were covered in blood and the murder weapon had his fingerprints all over it." Aaron stood up, her heels clicking against the floor. "Officer Martinez, isn't it true that my client was found unconscious when you first entered?" "He appeared dazed, yes." "And did you find any signs of the head injury he reported?" Martinez shifted in his seat. "There was some swelling, but nothing serious." "Nothing serious?" Aaron's voice sharpened. "Yet the medical report clearly shows—" "Objection, Your Honor," Monroe interrupted. "Counsel is testifying." "Sustained." The morning dragged on, each witness cementing the prosecution's case. Security footage showed Liam's patrol car arriving at the warehouse. The knife bore only his fingerprints. His own department testified about Vega's role as an informant in a case Liam had worked. During a brief recess, Liam watched through the courthouse window as an officer walked Titan across the lawn. The German Shepherd's head was low, his usual proud stance replaced with something more subdued. He was the only one who knew the truth, the only witness to what really happened in that warehouse. The jury filed back in after their deliberation, their faces grim. Liam's heart pounded as the judge spoke. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman stood. "We have, Your Honor." He unfolded a small piece of paper. "In the case of the state versus Liam Parker, we find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder." The words hit Liam like physical blows. Aaron's hand gripped his arm, but he barely felt it. "The court hereby sentences you to death by lethal injection," the judge declared, his voice echoing through the suddenly silent room. The gavel crashed down, the sound final and devastating. As officers approached to escort him out, Liam caught movement by the courtroom doors. Titan was being led past, straining against his leash toward Liam. The dog's whines cut through the murmur of the crowd, his dark eyes fixed on his partner. But the officers pulled Liam in the opposite direction, and the last thing he heard was Titan's desperate barking, fading behind the heavy wooden doors. The dim light in cell block D barely reached the corners of Liam's 8x10 home. He sat on his thin mattress, using a stubby pencil to mark another hash mark on the concrete wall. 6 months. That's all he had left. "You're going to wear that pencil down to nothing," Travis Reynolds said from the top bunk. The older inmate had been Liam's cellmate for 2 months now, his gruff wisdom a constant reminder of prison reality. Liam's finger traced the neat rows of marks. "Can't help counting." Travis swung his legs over the edge of his bunk, his weathered face appearing in the dim light. "Listen, man, I've seen guys like you come and go. The ones who keep hoping, they break the hardest." He shook his head. "You're dead to the world already. Sooner you accept that, the easier these last months will be." But Liam couldn't stop his mind from racing. During yard time, during meals, during the endless hours staring at gray walls, he replayed that night over and over. The warehouse, the darkness, the blow to his head. Why hadn't they killed him too? If someone wanted to frame him for Vega's murder, why leave him alive to tell his story? It didn't make sense. That evening, Liam sat at the small metal desk, writing another letter to Aaron. His pencil moved quickly across the paper. "Something's not right about that night. They could have killed me easily, made it look like a shootout gone wrong. Instead, they knocked me out and left evidence that would point to me. Why? There has to be a reason." He'd heard about Titan through the prison grapevine. His loyal partner had become impossible to handle, refusing to work with any other officer. The usually obedient dog had bitten 2 handlers and wouldn't respond to commands. The thought of Titan's distress made Liam's chest ache. The cell block was quieter at night, when most inmates retreated into themselves. Liam lay on his bunk, Travis's soft snoring above him, when voices drifted down the corridor. 2 guards were arguing in hushed tones. "Can't just ignore it," one was saying. "If what happened to Vega gets out." "Keep your voice down," the other guard hissed. Liam's heart began to pound. He slid silently from his bunk, moving closer to the cell door. "Look," the first guard continued, "I'm not getting mixed up in this. Ask Monroe if you want answers." "Monroe?" "The DA. Just drop it, okay? Some things are better left alone." Their footsteps faded down the corridor, but Liam stood frozen by the door, his mind racing. After months of silence, hearing Vega's name sent chills down his spine. Someone in this prison knew something about that night, something they were afraid would get out. He returned to his bunk, but sleep wouldn't come. Travis's words echoed in his head. "You're dead to the world already." But Liam knew he couldn't give up. Not now, not when the truth might be closer than he thought. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the prison visiting room as Liam waited, his hands trembling slightly. 2 weeks. That's all he had left. When the warden had offered him a final request, the words tumbled out before he could think. "I want to see my dog." The metal chair felt cold beneath him. Around the room, guards stood at attention, their faces blank. Liam recognized most of them after 6 months, except for the new guy, Monroe, who'd started just a few weeks ago. The door opened with a metallic creak. Erin Calloway stood in the corner, her face tight with what looked like guilt. But Liam barely noticed her. His eyes fixed on the German shepherd being led in on a thick leather leash. "Titan," he whispered. The dog looked different. His coat had lost its shine, and his eyes darted around the room with suspicion. This wasn't the confident K9 partner Liam remembered. This was a broken animal. But then Titan's gaze found Liam. The change was instant. The dog's ears perked up, and a high-pitched whine filled the room. Titan lunged forward, nearly pulling the handler off his feet, pressing his body against the visiting room bars. His tail wagged so hard, his whole body shook. Liam reached through the bars, his fingers finding the familiar spot behind Titan's ears. "Hey, buddy," he whispered, his voice rough. "I missed you too." For a moment, everything else faded away. The prison, the guards, the ticking clock of his execution. It was just him and his partner, reunited. Then everything changed. Titan's head snapped up, his attention fixing on something behind Liam. The dog's entire body went rigid. Guard Monroe had shifted position, taking a step closer to observe. The transformation was explosive. Titan's lips pulled back, revealing sharp teeth. A deep, threatening growl rumbled from his chest. Before anyone could react, the dog launched himself at Monroe, straining against his leash with such force that 2 handlers had to hold him back. The snarls echoed off the concrete walls as Titan tried desperately to reach Monroe. The guard stumbled backward, his face draining of color. His hand instinctively went to his belt, where his baton hung. "Get that animal under control," someone shouted. Liam watched, stunned. He'd never seen Titan react this way, not even to the most dangerous suspects they'd encountered on the job. The dog was trained to remain calm unless given a command. This reaction was pure instinct, pure rage. The handlers struggled with Titan, who wouldn't take his eyes off Monroe. They began dragging him toward the door, his claws scraping against the floor as he resisted. Liam turned to find Erin, already staring at him, her legal mind clearly spinning. She'd seen it too, seen how specific and targeted Titan's reaction had been. Dogs don't lie. Dogs don't forget. "Find out who that guy is," Liam said quietly, meeting her gaze. His voice was steady, certain. Erin nodded once, her eyes sharp with renewed purpose. The yellow glow of her desk lamp cast long shadows across Erin Calloway's office. Her eyes burned from staring at the laptop screen, but she couldn't stop. The image of Titan's reaction to guard Monroe kept replaying in her mind. She'd seen countless police dogs during her career, but never one that responded with such raw hostility without provocation. Pulling up her old case files, she typed Greg Monroe into the search bar. Her fingers drummed against the desk as the computer processed the request. The clock on her wall ticked past midnight, but sleep was the last thing on her mind. The search results populated her screen. Erin leaned forward, squinting at the text. "Former police officer," she muttered, scrolling through his employment history. Her heart quickened as she read the details of his dismissal. Excessive force during an arrest. 3 civilians had filed complaints, but the department had buried them until a video surfaced. She opened another tab, accessing the police database through her legal credentials. Cross-referencing Monroe's name with criminal investigations, she found a pattern. His name appeared in multiple reports involving organized crime, always on the periphery. Witnesses mentioned him, but charges were never filed. "Come on," she whispered, digging deeper. "Give me something." Then she saw it. Her hand froze on the mouse. The night of Vega's murder, Monroe had been working as a beat cop in that exact neighborhood. The patrol log showed him less than 2 blocks from the warehouse where Vega was killed. Erin sat back in her chair, her mind racing. It wasn't just a coincidence. Monroe had been there, and now he worked at the prison where Liam was counting down his final days. Her hands shook slightly as she picked up her phone and dialed the prison's number. After several transfers and security checks, Liam's voice came through the line. "Your dog just gave us a lead," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Monroe was a cop before he became a guard. He was fired for excessive force, but that's not all. He has connections to organized crime, and he was patrolling near the warehouse the night Vega was murdered." The line went quiet for a moment. When Liam spoke again, his voice was different, alive with something she hadn't heard since the trial. "Titan knew," he said. "He recognized Monroe from that night." "This could be what we've been looking for," Erin replied, shuffling through the papers on her desk. "But we need more than circumstantial evidence. We need proof that connects him directly to Vega's murder." The late evening sun cast long shadows through Erin's apartment windows as Titan paced restlessly from room to room. His nails clicked against the hardwood floors in an endless rhythm that matched Erin's own anxious heartbeat. The German shepherd hadn't touched his food bowl in days, leaving the kibble scattered across the floor from his agitated nudging. Every few minutes, Titan would return to the front door, pressing his nose against the bottom crack and whining softly. His brown eyes fixed on the doorknob, ears twitching at every sound from the hallway outside. Each time footsteps passed by, his tail would lift hopefully, only to drop again when they continued past. Erin sat cross-legged on her couch, watching the dog's desperate routine. Dark circles lined her eyes from sleepless nights spent reviewing case files. She'd gained temporary custody of Titan through a series of legal maneuvers, arguing that the dog was crucial evidence in an ongoing investigation. "You know something, don't you?" she muttered, watching Titan make another circuit of the apartment. The dog paused, turning his head toward her voice. Those intelligent eyes seemed to hold secrets she couldn't quite grasp. Making a sudden decision, Erin grabbed her keys from the coffee table. "Come on, boy," she called, clipping a leash to his collar. Titan followed eagerly, probably hoping this trip would lead to Liam. The drive to the warehouse was quiet, except for Titan's heavy breathing in the back seat. As Erin pulled up to the abandoned building, she noticed how Titan's entire body went rigid. His ears shot forward, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. The warehouse loomed before them, its broken windows like dark eyes staring down at them. The moment Aaron opened the car door, Titan burst out, nearly pulling her arm from its socket. He dragged her toward a narrow alley behind the building, his nose pressed firmly to the ground. Weeds pushed through cracks in the concrete as they moved deeper into the alley. The smell of rotting garbage and stale water filled the air. Titan's pace quickened, pulling Aaron along until they reached a rusty dumpster pushed against the building's wall. Suddenly, Titan began barking frantically, his paws scraping at the ground near the dumpster's base. Aaron knelt beside him, ignoring the dirt and grime. In the fading light, she could just make out something metallic, partially buried beneath years of accumulated trash. Her heart jumped as she brushed away some of the debris. There, half hidden and forgotten, was a small security camera. Its casing was rusted, but it looked intact. If it had been recording that night, if its memory card had somehow survived. Titan's barking echoed off the alley walls as Aaron carefully examined their discovery. The camera might hold the truth they so desperately needed, the key to saving Liam's life. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Aaron burst through the door of Henry Wu's cramped tech shop. The place smelled of coffee and electronics, with computer parts scattered across every available surface. Henry looked up from behind his cluttered desk, pushing his wire-rimmed glasses up his nose. "I need whatever's on this," Aaron said breathlessly, placing the rust-covered security camera on his desk. Her hands were still dirty from digging it out of the alley. Henry picked up the camera, turning it over with careful fingers. His usual smirk faded into a concerned frown as he examined the damaged casing. "This thing's ancient," he muttered, already reaching for his tools. "No promises." While Henry worked his magic on the camera, Aaron set up her laptop at a corner of his desk. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she dug through digitized police records. Something had to connect Monroe and Vega. People didn't just randomly frame cops for murder. Hours ticked by. Empty coffee cups piled up beside her. Then something caught her eye. A financial report buried in Vega's case file. She leaned closer, squinting at the numbers. An offshore account in Vega's name showed a $250,000 deposit just 1 week before his murder. "That's a lot of cash for a small-time informant," she whispered to herself. Following her instincts, she cross-referenced the bank's transaction records. Her heart skipped when another familiar name popped up. Greg Monroe had made a cash withdrawal from the same offshore bank 2 days after Vega's death. "Got something?" Henry called out suddenly, waving her over to his workstation. "Come look at this." Aaron rushed to his side, gripping the back of his chair as he pulled up a video file. The footage was grainy and dark, but clear enough to make out shapes moving in the warehouse. Her breath caught as she watched a figure in a prison guard's jacket approach Vega. The knife glinted in the dim light as it plunged forward. After Vega fell, the killer carefully wiped the weapon clean, then placed it in the hand of an unconscious man lying nearby. Liam. Aaron's heart pounded against her ribs as she watched the killer slip away into the shadows. They had it. They finally had proof of Liam's innocence. But with his execution scheduled in just days, would they be able to stop it in time? The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Aaron's office as she sent the recovered footage to the state attorney's office. Her hands trembled slightly as she typed the urgent appeal request, attaching all the evidence they'd gathered about Monroe's connection to Vega. She double-checked every detail before hitting send, knowing this could be Liam's last chance. 3 hours later, her phone buzzed. Instead of the response she'd hoped for, a text from an unknown number made her blood run cold. "Drop the case now. Final warning." She stared at the message, her throat tight. Someone wanted to bury the truth, someone with enough power to make threats. At the prison, Liam sat on his narrow bunk, trying to stay calm despite the execution date looming over him. Heavy footsteps approached his cell, and he looked up to see Monroe's face through the bars. The guard's expression was dark as he unlocked the door and stepped inside. Monroe moved close, his breath hot against Liam's ear. "You're not walking out of here," he sneered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Even if your little lawyer digs up dirt, this case is bigger than you." Liam's jaw clenched, but he remained silent. Inside, rage burned through his veins, but he wouldn't give Monroe the satisfaction of a response. As evening fell, Erin noticed something unsettling on her drive home. A black SUV with tinted windows kept appearing in her rearview mirror, matching her every turn. Her heart raced as she took a deliberate wrong turn. The SUV followed. No coincidence, then. Someone was definitely tailing her. She pulled into her apartment complex, hands shaking as she fumbled with her keys. Once inside, she quickly locked every door and window. Titan, who had been napping on her couch, lifted his head and watched her with alert eyes. The German shepherd suddenly sprang to his feet, hackles raised as he faced the front door. A low, threatening growl rumbled in his chest. Erin's breath caught as she noticed a shadow move past her window, too deliberate to be casual passerby. Her fingers trembled as she grabbed her phone, quickly dialing a number she hoped she'd never have to use. "I need protection," she whispered urgently, "and I need to move fast." Erin stood in her darkened living room, her knuckles white around the handle of an old baseball bat. Titan's low growl continued, his eyes fixed on the window. She crept closer to peer through a gap in the curtains, scanning the shadows outside. The street appeared empty, but her skin prickled with the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Moving quickly, she double-checked every lock in her apartment. The metal clicks of deadbolts sliding into place offered little comfort. Her hands shook as she grabbed her laptop from her briefcase. Opening her email, she began forwarding the warehouse footage to everyone she trusted, fellow attorneys, journalists, even her old law professor. If something happened to her, the truth wouldn't die with her. "Someone's on to me," Erin said into her phone, her voice tight with tension. On the other end, Henry Wu let out a worried breath. "Lay low, Erin. These people mean business," he warned. "I can't," she replied, already gathering her things. "Liam's running out of time." 20 minutes later, Erin marched through the doors of the district attorney's office, Titan at her heel. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows as she approached the clerk's desk, demanding an immediate review of the new evidence. The young clerk glanced nervously over his shoulder before leaning forward. "Someone already tried to block your submission," he whispered, his eyes darting around the empty office. Erin's stomach dropped, but she kept her voice steady. "I need to speak with the DA now." Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. Erin spotted the black SUV immediately. It sat 3 spaces away from her car, its engine idling. Her pulse quickened as she tightened her grip on Titan's leash. "Keep moving," she told herself, forcing her legs to carry her forward. The moment her key turned in the ignition, the SUV's engine roared to life. Erin's heart hammered against her ribs as she pulled out of the parking lot, watching the dark vehicle slide into traffic behind her. Erin's knuckles turned white as she gripped the steering wheel, her foot heavy on the gas pedal. The streets blurred past as she weaved through traffic, her heart pounding in her chest. Titan crouched in the passenger seat, his muscular body tense and alert, ears pinned back against his head. Every few seconds, bright headlights flooded her rearview mirror, making her squint and blink away the glare. Come on," she muttered, taking a sharp turn down Morrison Street. The SUV followed, its engine growling as it closed the gap. Erin's mind raced as she scanned the familiar streets, looking for an escape route. The black vehicle stayed glued to her bumper, matching her every move. A plan formed in her mind as she recognized the approaching intersection. Without signaling, she yanked the wheel hard, cutting across 2 lanes to make a sudden turn onto Cedar Avenue. The SUV swerved to follow, tires screeching against the pavement. Erin's breath came in short gasps as she pressed the accelerator harder. The police station was just 3 blocks ahead. Its brick facade appeared in the distance, a beacon of safety in the growing darkness. She shot through a yellow light, tires bumping over the curb as she pulled into the station's parking lot. In her mirror, she watched the SUV slow to a crawl at the entrance. Its dark windows revealed nothing about the driver inside. For a moment, it idled there, engine rumbling ominously. Then, without warning, it reversed and disappeared into the night, melting into the shadows like a ghost. Erin's hands trembled as she killed the engine. She sat there, breathing hard, her shirt damp with sweat. Titan whined softly, pressing his nose against her arm. She reached over to scratch behind his ears, trying to steady her racing pulse. "They didn't want the cops to see them," she whispered, more to herself than to Titan. "Which means we're getting close. Too close for their comfort." Inside the station, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Erin approached the front desk. "I need to speak with a detective," she demanded, her voice still shaky from the chase. "It's about the Liam Parker case." A young officer looked up from his computer, his expression skeptical. He couldn't have been more than a few years out of the academy. "The Parker case? That's closed." "No, it's not," Erin insisted, pulling out her laptop. "I have new evidence implicating a prison guard named Greg Monroe in Anthony Vega's murder. Someone just tried to run me off the road to keep me quiet about it." The officer's expression shifted from doubt to curiosity as Erin laid out the evidence. The recovered security footage, the offshore accounts, Monroe's suspicious past. He took detailed notes, occasionally glancing at Titan, who remained alert and watchful beside Erin. "I'll pass this up the chain," the officer finally said, closing his notebook. "But I can't promise anything." Erin nodded, knowing it wasn't enough. She looked down at Titan, who stood rigid. His fur still bristled from their earlier chase. "We're not done yet," she whispered, giving him a gentle pat. Liam sat cross-legged on his narrow prison bed, his eyes fixed on the gray concrete wall where he'd scratched 48 small marks. Each line represented an hour, the final countdown to his execution. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across his cell. His fingers traced the rough marks on the wall, remembering how different things had felt just a week ago. Back then, hope had seemed possible. Now, with only 2 days left, acceptance settled over him like a heavy blanket. Still, somewhere deep inside, a tiny flame of hope refused to die completely. Erin was still out there, still fighting. The sound of footsteps echoing down the corridor made him turn. Greg Monroe's familiar swagger came into view, keys jingling at his belt. The guard's face wore its usual smirk as he stopped in front of Liam's cell. "Tick-tock," Monroe taunted, tapping his wrist where a watch would be. "Getting close now, isn't it?" Liam stayed silent, studying Monroe's face. Something was different today. The guard's smile didn't quite reach his eyes, which darted nervously around the cell. His fingers drummed against his belt, a gesture Liam had never seen before. "You're scared," Liam said quietly, watching closely. For just a fraction of a second, Monroe's smirk faltered. It was tiny, barely noticeable, but Liam caught it. The guard's face quickly hardened again. But that brief slip told Liam everything he needed to know. "Keep dreaming," Monroe spat, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. He turned and walked away faster than usual, his boots clicking rapidly against the concrete floor. Across town, Erin sat hunched over her laptop, her eyes burning from staring at the screen for hours. Empty coffee cups littered her desk as she typed furiously, attaching files to yet another email. She'd contacted every journalist in her network, every reporter who'd ever covered wrongful convictions. "Someone has to listen," she muttered, hitting send on her 20th email of the day. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from Henry Wu, updating her on his progress with enhancing the security footage. Time was running out, but she refused to stop. Back in his cell, Liam noticed a change in the atmosphere. The usual prison routine felt different. Guards walked past more quickly than normal, speaking in hushed tones. He pressed himself against the bars, straining to hear their whispered conversations. "Can't believe what they found," one guard muttered as he passed. Another pair stopped nearby, their voices low but urgent. "The commissioner himself is involved." Liam's heart began to race. Something was happening, something big enough to make the guards nervous. He thought of Erin, wondering if she'd finally broken through, if she'd found the piece that would make everything fall into place. The whispers continued, growing more frequent. Every guard who passed seemed to be carrying some new piece of information, some fresh rumor. The tension in the air was electric, like the moment before a storm breaks. The newsroom buzzed with activity as the headline flashed across screens nationwide. "Breaking: New evidence in death row case. Prison guard linked to murder." Erin's phone lit up with notifications as the story spread like wildfire. Her hands trembled as she watched the journalist she'd contacted, Sarah Chen, deliver a detailed report about the recovered security footage. Sources have obtained evidence suggesting prison guard Greg Monroe's direct involvement in the murder of Anthony Vega, Sarah announced on live television. The footage appears to show Monroe at the scene, contradicting official testimony. Social media exploded. Within hours, number freed Liam Parker trended nationwide. Public outrage mounted as more details emerged about Monroe's suspicious financial transactions and his history of misconduct. Erin grabbed her coat and briefcase, her heart racing. This was their chance. Maybe their only chance. She drove through morning traffic toward the governor's office, rehearsing her arguments in her head. The flash drive in her pocket felt heavy with the weight of its contents. At the government building's entrance, a stern-faced security guard blocked her path. "The governor's office isn't taking unscheduled visitors." "This can't wait," Erin insisted, showing her credentials. "I have evidence that could prevent an innocent man's execution." A suited official emerged from behind the security desk. "Ms. Calloway, we don't overturn convictions based on online speculation and social media trends." Erin pulled out the flash drive, her voice steady despite her anger. "Then watch this. The complete, unedited footage. No speculation, just truth." Meanwhile, inside the prison, heavy footsteps approached Liam's cell. His muscles tensed as two guards he didn't recognize appeared at his door. "Parker," one called out, "you're being moved." Liam stood slowly, confusion mixing with hope. This wasn't normal procedure, not for a man scheduled to die tomorrow. The guards' expressions gave nothing away as they cuffed him and led him down an unfamiliar corridor. His heart hammered against his ribs. Something had changed. He could feel it in the way the other inmates watched him pass, in the unusual silence that followed him through the halls. Back at the governor's office, Erin stood in a conference room surrounded by officials as they watched the footage play on a large screen. The grainy images showed the warehouse interior clearly enough, Monroe's face visible as he stabbed Vega, then carefully placed the weapon in Liam's unconscious hand. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the soft whir of the video player as it continued to reveal the truth they'd all missed. When it ended, the silence felt heavy, almost suffocating. Finally, a senior official cleared his throat. "We need to stop that execution." He reached for his phone, his hands shaking slightly. "Right now." Erin's heart pounded so hard she could barely breathe. She watched as they began making calls, her mind racing with the same desperate question. Would they be in time? The governor's office hummed with tense voices as officials debated proper protocol. Erin paced the conference room, her fingers wrapped tightly around her phone. Every second felt like an eternity. "We need the proper documentation before," one aide started. "He dies tomorrow," Erin cut in, her voice sharp with frustration. She couldn't stand it anymore. This endless back and forth while Liam's life hung in the balance. Without another word, she grabbed her briefcase and stormed out of the room, leaving the startled officials mid-discussion. In the hallway, she punched in the prison warden's number, her hands shaking. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Each ring sent her heart rate climbing higher. Meanwhile, deep within the prison's concrete walls, Liam walked between 2 guards. Their footsteps echoed through the empty corridor as they approached the holding area, the last stop before the execution chamber. His mouth felt dry, and despite his efforts to stay composed, cold dread crept through his body. The guards hadn't spoken a word since they'd collected him from his cell. It wasn't normal. Usually there was some attempt at conversation, even if just procedural instructions. But this silence felt heavy, wrong. His police instincts, dulled by years behind bars but never completely gone, screamed that something was off. Finally, the warden's gruff voice came through Erin's phone. "Warden Hayes speaking." "This is Erin Calloway," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "You need to stop the execution. We have new evidence, concrete proof of Liam Parker's innocence. The governor's office is reviewing it right now." There was a long pause on the other end. "Ms. Calloway," the warden said slowly, "I understand your position, but without official orders, my hands are tied. It's not my call." "People are watching this case now," Erin pressed. "The media has the story. You can't—" "I follow protocol, Ms. Calloway. That's my job. Without a stay order, we proceed as scheduled." Erin's free hand clenched into a fist. She ran toward her car, her heels clicking against the pavement. Titan waited in the passenger seat, his ears perking up as she yanked the door open. "Fine," she snapped into the phone. "Then I'm coming there myself." She threw the car into drive and pressed the accelerator, tires squealing as she pulled out of the parking lot. The digital clock on her dashboard seemed to mock her, time slipping away too quickly. Titan whined beside her, picking up on her urgency. His dark eyes fixed on her face as she weaved through traffic, one hand still gripping her phone, waiting for it to ring with news from the governor's office. Every red light felt like torture. Every slow driver in her way made her want to scream. She had the truth, actual physical proof of Liam's innocence. But truth meant nothing if it didn't reach the right people in time. Greg Monroe's hands trembled as he watched the news report, his small office television blaring the damning headlines. New evidence in death row case, prison guard implicated. Grainy security footage from the warehouse played on screen, showing a figure in a guard's jacket, his jacket, moving through the shadows. Sweat trickled down his neck as he grabbed his burner phone. His fingers left damp marks on the keypad as he dialed a number he'd hoped never to use again. "It's me," he growled when the line connected. "They've got the footage. Parker needs to be gone. Tonight. No delays." The voice on the other end was cold, businesslike. "It'll cost you." "Whatever it takes," Monroe hissed. "Just make it happen." Inside the prison's sterile corridors, Liam noticed the change immediately. The guards flanking him weren't the usual crew. These men were strangers, their faces hard and unfamiliar. They gripped his arms too tightly, moving faster than normal protocol dictated. A high-ranking prison official watched from his office window as they escorted Liam across the yard. He picked up his phone, speaking in hushed tones. "Proceed as scheduled. Ignore any last-minute appeals." Outside the prison gates, Erin's car screeched to a halt at the security checkpoint. Her heart hammered as she thrust the stay of execution order through her window. "This is from the governor's office. You need to let me through now." The guard barely glanced at the paper. "Sorry, ma'am. Haven't received proper authorization to let you pass." "Authorization?" Erin's voice cracked with frustration. "It's right here in your hands." "Protocol requires verification from multiple departments," the guard drawled, deliberately slow. "Could take a while." Titan growled from the passenger seat, his hackles rising. Erin checked her watch, precious minutes ticking away while they played their game. "People will die if you don't let me through," she shouted, but the guards remained unmoved. In the execution chamber, fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows as technicians prepared the IV line. Liam lay strapped to the gurney, his chest rising and falling with quick, shallow breaths. The warden stood near the door, his usual authoritative demeanor replaced by obvious discomfort. One of the regular guards shifted uneasily. "Sir, this doesn't feel right. With all the new evidence." "Orders are orders," snapped one of the new guards, one of Monroe's men. His hand rested meaningfully on his weapon as he glared at his hesitant colleague. Liam watched the clear liquid being drawn into syringes, his heart pounding so hard he could hear blood rushing in his ears. The technician approached with the IV, and Liam closed his eyes, thinking of Titan, thinking of all the years stolen from him. The needle pressed against his skin. Titan's bark shattered the tense silence in Erin's car. The German shepherd threw himself against the passenger door, claws scraping frantically against the window. His whines grew more desperate with each passing second, dark eyes fixed on the prison building ahead. Erin gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. The guards were still reviewing her paperwork, their casual manner a clear sign they were running out the clock. Titan's distress confirmed what she already knew. Liam was running out of time. "Enough," she whispered. Without warning, she slammed the gear into reverse, tires squealing against pavement. The guard shouted, jumping back. Before they could react, she threw the car forward, accelerating straight toward the security gate. The metal barrier crumpled under the impact with a thunderous crash. Alarms blared through the compound as Erin leapt from the car, stay order clutched in her hand. "You will let me through!" Her voice carried over the chaos as she sprinted forward. Titan burst from the passenger side, taking the lead with determined focus. Guards poured out of the building, weapons drawn. But Erin held the paper high, her eyes blazing. "This is a stay of execution from the governor. Stand down!" The commotion reached the warden's office through his security radio. His face drained of color as he grabbed his phone. "Halt the execution! I repeat, halt the execution!" Inside the sterile chamber, the executioner's hand wavered over the controls. But one of Monroe's men stepped forward, his voice hard. "Complete the procedure. Now!" Liam watched helplessly from the gurney as the man reached for the switch. Time seemed to slow, each heartbeat stretching into eternity. The doors exploded inward with a bang. Titan's powerful form filled the doorway, his bark echoing off the walls. Erin burst in behind him, stay order raised like a shield. "Stop!" The word rang through the silent room. Everyone froze. The warden pushed through the crowd, taking the paper from Erin's trembling hands. His eyes scanned the document, then lifted to address the room. "The execution is stayed by order of the governor. Release him." The medical staff carefully removed the IV from Liam's arm as guards unstrapped his restraints. His whole body trembled, the aftermath of adrenaline coursing through his system. He sat up slowly, his eyes moving from Erin's determined face to Titan's protective stance beside her. The dog's ears remained alert, his gaze tracking every movement in the room. That's when Liam noticed one of Monroe's men, the guard who had tried to rush the execution, quietly backing toward the door. His eyes narrowed. "Don't let him leave," he said, his voice carrying an edge of steel. Two officers immediately blocked the exit, cutting off the guard's escape. The man's face paled as he realized he was trapped. Through the window of his office overlooking the yard, Monroe watched his carefully constructed plan crumble. His hands shook as he grabbed his keys and jacket. But as he turned to flee, he found two internal affairs investigators waiting in his doorway. Behind them stood several officers, their expressions hard. The news of the leaked footage had spread through the department like wildfire. His former allies were already distancing themselves, leaving him to face the consequences alone. Meanwhile, Erin cornered the warden in the hallway, outside the execution chamber. Her voice was quiet, but intense. "You knew something was wrong with this case. I saw it in your face. Why did you let it go this far?" The warden leaned against the wall, suddenly looking older and tired. He glanced around before speaking in a low voice. "Because the people behind this are bigger than just me." Later that night, guards escorted Liam to a temporary holding cell, a far cry from death row, but still behind bars. He sat on the narrow bed, processing how close he had come to death. Titan pressed against the bars, whining softly until Liam reached through to stroke his head. "You saved my life, buddy," Liam whispered, scratching behind Titan's ears. The dog's tail wagged gently, but his eyes remained alert, still standing guard. Erin watched from nearby, her laptop open as she continued gathering evidence. They had stopped the execution, but Monroe was still out there. This was just the beginning of their fight for true justice. Greg Monroe paced in his dingy motel room, his composure finally cracking. The news had exploded with coverage of Liam's near execution and the evidence linking Monroe to Vega's murder. His phone buzzed constantly with texts from former colleagues, all of them backing away, protecting themselves. He pulled out a worn duffel bag and started stuffing it with clothes. His hand shook as he counted the stack of cash he'd withdrawn earlier, just enough to disappear. The fake passport he'd arranged would be ready in hours. South America seemed like his best bet now. "Should have killed Parker when I had the chance," he muttered, shoving the last of his belongings into the bag. At the Internal Affairs office, Erin spread her evidence across the conference table. The recovered security footage played on a laptop, showing the figure in the guard's jacket clearly stabbing Vega. She handed over bank statements showing the suspicious offshore transactions. "There's more," she said, pulling out a thick file. "Monroe's history of excessive force complaints, his connections to local gangs, everything." The investigators moved quickly, phones ringing as they coordinated with other agencies. Within hours, they had a warrant for Monroe's arrest. But when the SWAT team breached his apartment, they found only empty drawers and a half-eaten meal. In the prison's interview room, Liam sat across from two investigators, recounting every detail of that night at the warehouse. His voice remained steady as he described being knocked unconscious. "Monroe must have been waiting there," Liam explained. "He knew Vega would show up." At the mention of Monroe's name, Titan, who had been lying quietly beside Erin's chair, lifted his head and growled deeply. The sound was different from his usual alerts, more personal, filled with recognition. Erin straightened in her chair. "Wait," she said, studying Titan's reaction. "Titan knows something else, something we haven't found yet." She got permission to take Titan to retrace Monroe's steps. They visited his apartment building first, then his regular haunts. At each stop, Titan searched thoroughly, but showed no special interest. When they pulled into the Paradise Motel's parking lot, everything changed. Titan's body went rigid, his nose lifting to catch a scent. He tugged hard on his leash, pulling Aaron toward a narrow alley behind the building. Among scattered trash and broken glass, Titan stopped and pawed at something. Aaron knelt down and picked up a cheap burner phone, recently discarded. She turned it over in her hands, her pulse quickening. This was it, Monroe's last link to his contacts, carelessly tossed aside in his rush to escape. Monroe's hands trembled as he dialed the last number he had left. A direct line to Captain Reynolds, one of the officials who'd helped bury evidence in the Vega case. The phone rang 3 times before a gruff voice answered. "You've got some nerve calling this number." "I need help," Monroe said, his voice cracking. "Just enough cash to get out of the country. I've got dirt on all of you." "Are you threatening me?" Reynolds cut him off with a cold laugh. "You're toxic now, Monroe. Nobody's touching this. You're on your own." The line went dead. Monroe slumped against the wall of his hideout, an abandoned office in the industrial district. His last lifeline had just been severed. Through the grimy window, he watched Aaron's car pull into the lot across the street. That damn dog was with her again. A savage smile crossed his face. If he was going down, he'd take them with him. Inside the prison, a janitor slipped a folded note through the bars of Liam's cell. Without a word, the man shuffled away, disappearing around the corner. Liam unfolded the paper, his blood running cold as he read the message. "Watch your lawyer. She's next." His hands shaking, Liam grabbed the phone during his allowed call time. He dialed Aaron's number repeatedly, but each time it went straight to voicemail. "Come on, pick up," he muttered, panic rising in his chest. Across town, Aaron followed Titan through the maze of warehouses and abandoned buildings. The dog moved with purpose, nose to the ground, tracking a scent only he could detect. The industrial district was eerily quiet, their footsteps echoing off concrete walls. From his hiding spot behind a stack of shipping crates, Monroe watched them approach. His finger tightened on the trigger of his gun. This was it, his last chance to silence the people who'd ruined everything. Titan suddenly froze, his ears pricking forward. A metallic clang echoed from behind the crates. Aaron's heart jumped into her throat as she heard the unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked. The first shot rang out, the sound bouncing off the warehouse walls. The gunshot echoed through the industrial district as Aaron dove behind a rusty dumpster, her heart pounding against her ribs. Titan planted himself in front of her, his muscular body tense and alert, a deep growl rumbling from his chest. "Should have left this alone," Monroe's voice carried across the empty lot as he stepped out from behind the crates. His face was twisted with desperation, the gun steady in his trembling hands. Aaron pressed her back against the cold metal of the dumpster, her breath coming in short gasps. She could smell motor oil and rotting garbage, feel the rough concrete scraping her palms. Another shot cracked through the air, pinging off the dumpster inches from her head. Without warning, Titan launched himself forward like a furry missile. His powerful body slammed into Monroe, catching him off guard. The gun flew from Monroe's hand, clattering across the pavement. Aaron scrambled toward the weapon, but Monroe recovered quickly. His fist connected with her jaw, sending her stumbling backward. Stars exploded in her vision as she hit the ground hard. Monroe lunged for her, his weight pinning her down. His hands found her throat, squeezing. Just as black spots started dancing in front of her eyes, Titan struck again. The German Shepherd's teeth sank into Monroe's forearm with crushing force. Monroe let out an agonized scream, releasing Aaron as he tried to shake the dog off. "Get off me!" Monroe howled, thrashing wildly. But Titan held firm, giving Aaron the chance she needed. She rolled to her feet, snatching up the gun. Her hands were steady as she aimed it at Monroe. "It's over," she said. her voice hoarse but determined. In the distance, police sirens began to wail. Panic flashed across Monroe's face. He wrenched his arm free from Titan's grip and tried to bolt, but he didn't get far. Titan sprang after him, catching him in mid-stride. Dog and man went down in a tangle of limbs, with Titan keeping Monroe firmly pinned to the ground. Red and blue lights flooded the lot as police cars screeched to a halt. Officers poured out, weapons drawn. They quickly cuffed Monroe, who cursed and struggled the entire time. Erin dropped to her knees beside Titan, her hands shaking as she ran them through his thick fur. "You did good, boy," she whispered, watching as the officers led Monroe away. Hours later, Greg Monroe sat in the interrogation room, his face pale and drawn. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows under his eyes as two investigators leaned forward across the metal table. "Life in prison, Monroe," the first investigator said, sliding crime scene photos across the table. "That's what you're looking at. Murder, conspiracy, corruption, the works." Monroe's fingers twitched against the cold metal surface. His lawyer whispered something in his ear, but he barely seemed to hear it. The weight of everything was crashing down around him. "Or," the second investigator added, "we can talk about a deal. 20 years, possibility of parole. But we need everything. Names, dates, details." Monroe's shoulders slumped. The fight drained from his face as he looked at the photos. Vega's body, the warehouse, the knife that had framed an innocent man. "Fine," he whispered. "I'll tell you everything." The confession spilled out like a broken dam. He described how Vega had been working with local gangs, helping them move product through the prison system. Monroe had been their inside man, taking cuts from every deal. But Vega got greedy, threatened to expose everything. "I couldn't let him talk," Monroe said, his voice hollow. "When Parker got that call about the warehouse, it was perfect. I knew he'd come alone, just him and that dog. I knocked him out, used his knife on Vega. Figured a dead cop was better than a live one asking questions." In the courthouse the next day, Liam stood straight back beside Erin as the judge reviewed the new evidence. Titan sat quietly at his feet, his presence a steady comfort. The courtroom was packed, but completely silent. The judge looked up from the papers, her expression stern but compassionate. "In light of the new evidence, including Mr. Monroe's full confession and the security footage confirming his account, I have no choice but to overturn the conviction of Liam Parker. Mr. Parker, you are hereby exonerated of all charges." The words hung in the air for a moment before reality sank in. Liam's legs felt weak as years of fear and anger and hopelessness lifted from his shoulders. He felt Titan press against his leg, the dog's tail wagging slowly. Erin squeezed his arm, her own eyes bright with tears. The gallery erupted in applause, but Liam barely heard it. He was free, really, truly free. Outside the courthouse, camera flashes popped like lightning as reporters shouted questions. Liam ignored them all, dropping to his knees on the courthouse steps. Titan bounded into his arms, tail wagging furiously as he covered Liam's face with enthusiastic kisses. Liam buried his face in Titan's fur, holding his partner close. When he finally looked up, he found Erin watching them with a soft smile. "You never gave up," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Erin glanced down at Titan, who was still pressed against Liam as if afraid to let him go. "Neither did he," she replied softly. The courthouse steps buzzed with activity as Liam Parker stood in the bright afternoon sunlight. His eyes squinted, still adjusting to the intensity after years of dim prison lighting. Everything felt overwhelming. The traffic noise, the rustling trees, even the warmth of the sun on his skin. Titan pressed against his leg, a steady anchor in the chaos. Reporters swarmed around them like hungry moths, microphones thrust forward. Their questions blended together in a cacophony of sound. "Mr. Parker, how does it feel to be free? What are your plans now? Will you sue the department?" Liam's throat felt tight. The words wouldn't come. Each flash of cameras made him flinch slightly, his prison instincts still raw and reactive. Erin noticed his discomfort and stepped in, gently guiding him through the crowd toward her car. Titan followed closely, creating a protective barrier between Liam and the pressing journalists. Once inside the car, silence fell like a heavy blanket. Erin turned the key and the engine hummed to life. "Where to?" she asked softly, watching Liam's reflection in the rearview mirror. He stared out the window, his expression lost. The world beyond the glass seemed foreign now. His old apartment was long gone, his possessions sold or stored away. His police badge, once his pride, was just a memory. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Erin nodded, understanding flickering across her face. Without a word, she pulled away from the curb and started driving. The city streets gradually gave way to more open spaces until they arrived at a familiar chain-link fence. Liam's heart squeezed as he recognized the Police K-9 training field. How many hours had he spent here with Titan, running drills, building trust? It felt like another lifetime. They got out of the car, and Titan's entire demeanor changed. His tail started wagging, and his ears perked up as memories of countless training sessions came flooding back. "Go on," Liam said softly, unclipping the leash. Titan bounded across the field, his powerful legs carrying him through the familiar obstacle course. He leapt over barriers and ducked through tunnels, moving with pure joy. His ears flapped in the wind, tail streaming behind him like a banner. Liam watched, something warm and forgotten stirring in his chest. Titan looked completely at peace, free from the tension and worry that had marked their years apart. The dog ran back to Liam, circled him once, then took off again, celebrating his partner's freedom in the only way he knew how. That evening, in the quiet of Erin's guest room, Liam lay on his back, staring at unfamiliar ceiling patterns. The bed felt too soft after years of prison bunks. Freedom, he was learning, would take some getting used to. Titan lay curled at his feet, a warm, steady presence. The dog hadn't left his side since they arrived, as if afraid Liam might disappear again. "What now, buddy?" Liam whispered into the darkness. Titan's only response was a gentle sigh, his body rising and falling with each breath. Liam stood in the familiar hallway of his old precinct, the polished floors and buzzing fluorescent lights unchanged after all these years. Titan walked beside him, alert and protective. Officers who passed by quickly averted their eyes or ducked into doorways. These same people had once shared coffee with him, celebrated birthdays, backed him up on dangerous calls. "Parker." Officer Martinez nodded stiffly as he passed, his face a mask of discomfort. Others pretended to be absorbed in paperwork or conversations, though their whispers followed him down the corridor. At the chief's office, Chief Reynolds extended a weak handshake. His grip was loose, almost reluctant. "Glad you made it through, Parker," he said, the words hollow and rehearsed. The same man who had pinned Liam's badge on him years ago now couldn't even meet his eyes. Later that week, Liam sat across from the department's review board requesting reinstatement. The panel shuffled papers uncomfortably, exchanging glances. "There's too much controversy right now," Captain Harris explained, his tone carefully neutral. "The department needs time to recover from this situation." Erin, sitting beside Liam, leaned forward. He was exonerated. The evidence proved his innocence. The real killer confessed. But Liam barely heard the back-and-forth arguments. Looking around the room at the familiar faces, he felt something shift inside him. These walls, once his second home, now felt suffocating. The badge he'd once worn with pride seemed tarnished by betrayal. "It's okay," he said quietly, cutting off Aaron's passionate defense. "I don't want to come back." The room fell silent. Titan pressed closer to his leg, offering silent support. Later, in Aaron's office, Liam explained his decision. "They all knew me," he said, absently scratching behind Titan's ears. "Worked with me for years. Not one of them questioned my conviction. Not one fought for the truth." Aaron nodded, understanding in her eyes. "But what you did for me," Liam continued, straightening in his chair. "You never knew me before, had no reason to believe in me, but you kept digging until you found the truth." He pulled out a stack of papers, case files he'd been collecting. "There are others out there like me, innocent people behind bars because no one will look deeper." "I can't change what happened to me," he told her, determination replacing the hurt in his voice. "But maybe I can stop it from happening to someone else." That evening, Liam spread the files across his small apartment table. News clippings, court transcripts, and appeal documents created a maze of potential injustices. Titan settled beside him, resting his heavy head on Liam's knee, as he worked through each case, looking for patterns, inconsistencies, anything that might point to another wrongful conviction. The work absorbed him completely. Each story echoed pieces of his own, evidence that didn't quite fit, witnesses who changed their stories, investigations that stopped too soon. He made notes, drew connections, highlighted suspicious gaps in testimonies. 6 months after his exoneration, Liam stood outside a modest brick building in downtown, squinting at the fresh lettering on the glass door. Parker and Calloway Investigations. Beside him, Aaron adjusted her blazer, a mix of excitement and concern on her face.
"Are you sure about this?" she asked, her keys jingling in her hand. "Starting a firm from scratch won't be easy."
Liam nodded, his expression resolute. The morning sun caught the silver threading through his dark hair, earned during his years behind bars. Titan sat at attention between them, his tail sweeping the sidewalk. "Never been more sure of anything," Liam replied, reaching down to scratch Titan's ears. "Those years inside, I met so many guys who might have been innocent. No one would listen to them. No one would look deeper." Inside, the office still smelled of fresh paint and new carpet. They'd kept it simple. 2 desks, a small conference room, and a corner area with a plush dog bed for Titan. The walls were bare except for their licenses and certifications, and a single-frame newspaper article about Liam's exoneration. Their first client arrived just after lunch, Marcus Chen, barely 22, charged with armed robbery. His hands trembled as he sat across from them, his voice cracking as he told his story. "I was at my grandmother's house that night. I swear," he insisted, his eyes darting between Liam and Aaron. "But they found my jacket near the scene, and a witness picked me out of a lineup." Liam watched the young man carefully, recognizing the desperate edge in his voice, the way his shoulders hunched under the weight of accusations. He saw himself in Marcus's nervous fidgeting, in the dark circles under his eyes. "You got a dog?" Liam asked suddenly. Marcus blinked, thrown by the unexpected question. "No, sir. Why?" "Then we'll just have to trust your word," Liam said, offering a reassuring smile. He glanced at Titan, who had moved closer to Marcus, tail wagging gently, a good sign. The dog had become an excellent judge of character during their years together. After the meeting, they walked Marcus out. The young man stood straighter now, hope replacing some of the fear in his eyes. As the door closed behind him, Titan padded along beside them, his nails clicking on the hardwood floor. He wasn't wearing a police vest anymore, no badge or official designation. His days of chasing down suspects and searching crime scenes were over, but he still had a job to do. Liam watched as Titan settled into his new bed, alert but relaxed. This time, their work wasn't about following orders or enforcing laws. It was about something more important: finding the truth, no matter how deeply it was buried. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grassy field as Liam watched Titan explore his newfound freedom. The German shepherd bounded through the tall grass, stopping occasionally to roll on his back, legs kicking playfully at the sky. It was a side of him Liam hadn't seen since before that fateful night at the warehouse. Memories washed over him like gentle waves. Titan's fierce protectiveness during their last prison visit, his unwavering determination as he led Aaron to the hidden camera, the way he'd never given up hope, even when everyone else had. While the world had turned its back on Liam, Titan had remained steadfast, his loyalty never wavering for a moment. The grass rustled beneath Liam's boots as he walked to where Titan lay contentedly in a sunny patch. Kneeling beside his old partner, he ran his fingers through the dog's thick fur, scratching that special spot behind his ears that always made Titan's tail thump against the ground. "You saved my life, you know that?" Liam's voice was soft, thick with emotion. Titan responded by lifting his head and licking Liam's face enthusiastically, his tail beating a steady rhythm against the earth. "Guess I owe you one." Reaching into his jacket pocket, Liam pulled out a tennis ball, its bright yellow surface catching the golden light. Titan's ears perked up immediately, his body tensing with anticipation. When Liam threw the ball, Titan shot after it like lightning, his powerful legs carrying him across the field, as if years had melted away and he was that eager rookie again, chasing down his first lead. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Liam stood quietly watching his best friend race back and forth across the field. Each time Titan returned with the ball, his eyes sparkled with the same unwavering trust they'd always held. Through the darkest days of his imprisonment, through every setback and betrayal, Titan had never stopped believing in him. And now, standing in this peaceful field with his faithful partner, Liam realized something profound. He'd finally learned to believe in himself too. Some partners carried badges, others just carried faith. If you enjoyed the story of Liam and Titan, I handpicked this next story that you will love. Please don't miss this one. Click. If you enjoyed the story of Liam and Titan, I handpicked this next story that you will love. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.